Hi,
Go
this is
ahead.
Wil Reilly, and you're watching the Break It Down show with Pete Turner. Glad
Yeah,
to be.
we were just having a conversation about administration and how everywhere you go, like the army, the schools, where he's at, people always want you to do stuff. And I was going to say to you, we were talking about like getting accredited for things, and this is a good segue for me here as we jump into our conversation about the election and everything. But when you look at all of the things that have to be accounted for when you do the job, it's all in order to like prove that is Will working, is he doing the job? And same thing with me. Like I would send in my timesheet as a federal employee, and it would say like 115 hours that week because I'm in a fucking combat zone, right? And I'm working with the 82nd Airborne, who's notorious for just outworking, out slamming their head. Like I will slam my head into this wall until this wall falls down. And so I've literally seen it. Like if you go home, when you're working with the 82nd and you're deployed, if you go home at 14 hours, they look at you like, and they want to call you half day, like because you're goofing around or something. So, but they would never just send a person to follow you around and be like, Will is so damn busy. You know what? Let's just leave him alone. Let's accredit him and let him get on his work. They never do that. It's always some other secondary measurement thing. And that's a whole long way of getting to my question, which is when we look at policy and elections and all this other kind of stuff, it seems like we're struggling to create a situation where most of us think that the election is legitimate. I mean, the last one was contested through all 4 years, right? He was never the guy. And then the folks that threw all these Hail Marys and then said all these things and lied all the ways they lied. And I'm not talking about Donald Trump right now. You have to clarify this. I'm talking about the Democrats. Now they're going to, go the opposite direction. And like the duplicitousness is just ruining our elections and our trust and faith in our institutions. Like the FBI is less trusted. Congress is always 20% or less in terms of approval rating. I'm going to shut up now and let the smart guy talk.
Well, I think we're both smart guys, Pete. But I mean, yeah, so this is a real problem. Like, I remember when I was a kid, I went to the store and I was confused by the concept of money. Like, I already knew the concept of work. My mom and my uncle started me off pretty early. You work and so you eat. But I didn't get the idea that if you worked for someone that was outside of the family, they'd give you this look like a leaf. I was like 8 or 9, and you could take it to the store and you could buy delicious things. And at one point, I asked my uncle Ronald Earl, why do people give me stuff for this worthless paper? And he said, he was a veteran himself, like, because we're America, we fought to make this paper worth something. We all agree this paper's worth something. But although it's a funny story, the underlying reality is that if we didn't agree the money was worth something, it wouldn't be. So civilization is a thin veneer over savagery, essentially. I mean, we've seen, left and right, both with their own flags fighting in the street this summer. That's the natural state of man, not living in skyscrapers. So our institutions have institutional legitimacy because we've given it to them over the centuries. We assume that when elections take place, they're conducted fairly. And that makes the individual election judge who might want to mark 50 ballots for the other party problematic, which is very easy to do, by the way, and throw them away, not do that, because that's not how it works in America. God damn it. And over the past 4 years, we have seen a lot of attacks on that model. And most people by this point in the country probably know I have sort of a center-right bias. But I do think it's fair to say we've seen this mostly from the left. I mean, after Trump was elected, there were fairly prominent figures, including people like attorney generals, that just said, we're going to get this guy. We're going to, the hashtag resistance started within 11 hours of Trump being inaugurated. So the idea was we're going to take down whatever it is that this guy, this big goof, this obese buffoon is trying to do. And that led into Russiagate, which we now know is pretty much a fake story. I've read the Mueller report. I have a lot of respect for Robert Mueller. I mean, there were 2 meetings with the Russians, both of which I would call low-level staff meetings. And only one of them was the president's son, even present. This wasn't Russian spies in the Oval Office, But Russiagate went on for years. Then they impeached the guy on these flimsy charges. And through this all, there were these claims. Remember when he was supposed to be taking the mailboxes? Yes. And making it impossible for a working class individual to vote because he's taking the mailboxes out of the communities. And this just went on and on and on. And I think by the end, obviously, people did have less regard for our election system. Trump himself, though, if you're being honest from that military, that business perspective, like him or not, I mean, he's not helping this. He actually tweeted today, I won the election. I mean, this is a situation where This guy's in court in a major case trying to see if he could have won the election. There's about maybe a 15, 20% chance. So going out there and saying this kind of nonsense, I mean, what do you think the judge is going to do? I mean, we've seen this on all sides, really taking down these power systems, which is an issue.
Yeah, and I wanted to add to the Democratic approach to this whole thing. They come at him, they take the gloves off, and they come at him, through Russia, through Ukraine. The 25th Amendment was brought up probably quarterly throughout his presidency. All of these things were like, no matter what, no holds barred, we're going after this guy. Hail Mary after Hail Mary after Hail Mary. And now you expect him to act in some way kind towards that thing. And we're also supposed to believe that you didn't do the same thing in the election, because it only takes, look, I'll say this openly right now as a spy. If you gave me $5 million and said, flip as many votes as you can, I'd be a vote flipping motherfucker. I would move people around quickly. It's not hard to do. People need 500. Here's $500. Here's $100. Whatever it is. And I would legitimately, invisibly go out and flip these things. The other thing I wanted to say too, and because Donald Trump is a problem, right? And when I try to figure out, is the juice and the squeeze, are they in anywhere near alignment with Donald Trump? And it's not, because his ego causes him to further divide us, and we have families breaking apart. Kids getting rid of their parents or getting rid of brothers. And that's just not something that a president needs to foster. We got enough of that on our own. And so it's sort of this, we've got shitheads on the left, shitheads on the right, It's terrible.
Yeah, well, I mean, so first of all, I'm a big fan of this idea of gentlemanly dignity. I mean, if you ask me my favorite president, obviously, Abe Lincoln or something like that. But after that, you'd have to say someone like Eisenhower. There was a long expectation for a while that leaders of the country, whether they came from the right, whether they came from that Union center left, would keep some of their disagreements about the nature of the country, in the Senate hall or even behind closed doors, that the president would show up in a suit and not scream profanity on television and look stable, so that other countries would be encouraged to trade with us, hesitate to go to war with us. I'm a big supporter of that. So no, I don't, obviously Trump hasn't been the best guy for that. Trump, this actually gets into why Trump was elected. Like, a lot of people on the right like Trump because of the idea that he's a counterpuncher. If you listen to intelligent but just straight up right-wing voices like Ben Shapiro, they'll very openly say this, that for the past 30 years, and political scientists have vetted this, and it's true, by the way, more than 65% of mainstream news media coverage of every Republican candidate, except maybe Ben Carson, has been negative. Mitt Romney was going to put y'all back in chains. There's a flimsy defense that Biden was actually talking about economics and so on, but that's one of the most famous quotes from that race. So a lot of guys on the right said, if we're going to take this from the media, no matter what, let's run the political equivalent of Rush Limbaugh. Let's run a big trash talking guy, Bill O'Reilly. Let's run somebody that's going to go out there and have fun and roast the media, guy in a big Brooks Brothers suit. Let's see what happens. But what happens when you run that guy is that he doesn't stop being that guy after he wins a primary. So, I mean, everything has been some kind of a damn debate. One of my relatives, probably my mom, actually used to say something that I still sometimes find myself saying in like relationship arguments. Like, we don't need to do point counterpoint on everything. Let's figure out what the actual issue is and solve it. And then if the fault was mine, I'll apologize. Trump is the point counterpoint on everything guy. Where he'll have interviews with people that are programmed to be friendly, like Fox era Megyn Kelly, and wind up in these lengthy arguments. Or he'll take on Republican and conservative Democratic governors of states over things like PPE being sent out. So yeah, that obviously is the big disadvantage of Trump. I don't want to get too much into, a pops on both your houses, though. I think it's really obvious that there is an organized left-wing movement in the USA that is almost the equivalent of the alt-right on the right, but that is much, much, much larger and that has some actual political influence, that wants to dramatically shift the USA in terms of some of these proposals, like the Green New Deal being softly endorsed by Biden, police defunding, 1619 history. And these people were going to attack any Republican candidate, and they have been responsible for most of the attacks launched against Trump. So, I mean, it's obviously there are knuckleheads on the right and the left, but when you look at the massive riots this past summer, which were concentrated. I actually wanted to test my own bias once. So I looked at these and I found that almost all of them were concentrated in blue cities, in blue states, following the death of generally politically left-leaning Black individuals who were often criminals. Left-wing figures became involved with the riots, offering to bail out rioters and quote-unquote protesters, so on down the line. So like the argument that we're now seeing, this tenditious argument, well, most of those were provocateurs from the right, that's literally nonsensical. I mean, we have point of evidence that it's not. If you look at any of the major incidents from kind of the riot summer, I mean, the killing of the hero cop David Dorn, the burning of the old 3rd Precinct, that classic building in Minneapolis, I mean, the looting of the Mag Mile in Chicago, which is all on video, where we had to raise the bridges into the downtown of the city like this was Batman Begins.
Seriously.
The Hakeem Littleton riots, which started around the Detroit housing projects. You know, the setup of Chaz, where we actually know the leaders. I mean, I've talked to some of them green room style before shows. Like Raz Simone, I've never really encountered, but it's allegedly a very funny guy. But none of those guys are white supremacists. They're like 40 to 50% Black. If you actually look at, and really, this is just in passing in terms of, you know, the media we were both on. These aren't friends or anything, but I mean, just to clarify, but none of these things were launched by Nazis. So we can definitely say there's a nutty left in the USA. But at the same time, obviously, Donald Trump's style has exacerbated that to some extent and has really provoked the supposedly neutral media. So there are a lot of situations where you would have wished that he would have gone out, here's a jab for a reporter or something, and said, you know, Eisenhower style, it doesn't seem too fair and balanced to me, and then gone on with his presentation as opposed to some of his actual reactions.
Yeah. How much of a problem is this media bias? I mean, if it's scientifically evident, why hasn't the right wins on AM radio all the time, right? They dominate that, but who's on AM radio? Maybe that's why they win there. But what is the cost of that when you have these tech giants like Twitter? I saw a Twitter thing where someone wrote something about the election and they said, officials have announced it was Joe Biden, but no, they have not, right? We have a system for this. We're in the middle of it. But here we are openly putting out something that's absolutely not a fact. And it's the antithesis of what they're trying to do with Donald Trump. Like they're attacking Donald Trump and any kind of, he gets to say he won. Joe Biden gets to say they won. And now because they can't agree, we have a system to sort it out.
Yeah, I mean, so one of the huge elephants in the room this entire election cycle has been the social media and mainstream media control of knowledge. I personally think Trump would have won flat out by 2 or 3 percentage points with even a reasonably fair media and social media culture. I mean, right before the election, you saw the Republicans drop their October surprise and be prevented from sharing or releasing it. And this, we all know this, but I'm going to just recap this because this is so insane. When you look at the Hunter Biden story was valid. Again, like I have a bias and I like to vet things, like looking at the exact location of the riots to make sure I'm making good strategic decisions and I'm not just acting on bias. This was another one of these situations. I mean, so if you do kind of a logic model and you look at that whole Hunter Biden situation, the Joe Biden campaign didn't deny that this was real, ever. The guy, Bobulinski, who was implicated in some of this, went on Fox News primetime and talked about his exact role. The laptop computer is in the possession of the FBI, who didn't ever discount it as compromat, as Russian material, anything like that. You can go on an edgy but real site like GTV or WikiLeaks and see like the Hunter Biden foot job bluntly video. I haven't watched it myself, but I mean, I've seen the pictures and the guy's smoking crack in one of them, possibly meth. This is all real, very public information. The New York Post, which is the top 10 national newspaper, although right-leaning, broke the story. This wasn't the National Enquirer. So this was largely undisputed. But the backlash to it was really, really remarkable. Like the New York Post's Twitter account was shut down for 3 weeks.
Yeah.
But I mean, that blocking probably 50 million viewers when you look at the kind of stories a paper at that level is going to release. They have almost the circulation of the Times. Then Twitter began suspending the accounts of anyone else to share a tweet about this front page New York Post story. Again, just serious material. Then Facebook announced within that same day they weren't going to allow the story to be shared at all until it was fact checked by, an unbiased fact checker like the Huffington Post or whoever would take that assignment. And this just went on and on and on, where the October surprise dropped. And it was real. Like, the thing that mattered in the emails was the claim that access had been provided to the big guy, which is pretty clearly, Joe Biden. Right. And media just stopped it from having an effect. I mean, they cut down the circulation of that story by probably 90 or 95%. Now, I don't have any sympathy with Trump's childish tweets, but they're doing the same thing where he'll say something like, we're still in court, elections hotly contested. That's pretty much true. And there'll be this blue lit barrier underneath it that says, some election experts disagree with this. And wits on Twitter have started making fun of this because it turns out that font is easy to write in. It's just like blue 24 point. So people are posting under the theory of evolution and so on, origin of species, like, this is disputed by virtually all theologians, just making jokes. But I mean, that is a serious problem, this control of information. And I won't just ramble on, but we see this in the social sciences as well, where the dictionary recently changed the definition of terms like racist.
Yeah.
Young wokies apparently contacted them and said, well, you don't have a systemic racism definition in here. You're just going with the one in quant science, like dislike of people of another race. Can you move the systemic definition up to the number 2 definition of racism? And if you Google today, you'll see this from, I believe, Webster's. So you don't need to burn the books anymore. Information changes in real time. You'll look at the definition of racism and you'll think probably at some vague level, unless you're an academic, oh, I don't remember that, but that must be the definition because they don't just change the dictionary. But the reality is that they kind of do.
Dictionaries change, language evolves. All these things happen all the time. I mean, is this a norm? I mean, academics, like, we have to define our terms, right? All these things. And as language changes and evolves, things like systemic racism, I mean, all of these compound words that we have now, there's so many of them because we're trying to communicate something. And maybe, the left has a bad habit of getting their words and their etymologies wrong. I don't know why it is, and I'm making an unfair, biased statement, but like unisex bathrooms, no, it's omnisex or some other prefix in front of it, right? Like, we have to get these things right. So Black Lives Matter is a terrible slogan because it instantly creates a fight. And then, you don't get to go for, like, we all want the condition of the downtrodden, the oppressed to improve. That's part of the American deal. But when you can't define something, I don't know, how much of a problem is that when they just want to update things? Is that even a thing that we have to worry about?
Well, yeah, I think more broadly, and now we're both kind of wonks, so I actually feel your point. I feel the same way about ebonics, which comes from ebony phonics. Like, you need a better name, right, man. Yeah. But I don't think that's the root problem here. I think the root problem here is what you could call 1984 syndrome, where people have a set of assumptions that come from pre-existing information that existed out there in the world, i.e. the definitions of words that you have in your mind, unless you're an autodidact genius, probably come from the dictionary. Now we're seeing people subtly behind the scenes reshape this stuff. And this happens all the time with changes in content. I don't want to single out the Washington Post, but I use their police shootings database, for example, for my research on police shootings. And my friend partner Jane, who's one of the best researchers I know, told me the other day, like, one of the things with this database is that they seem to keep going in there and low-key changing the information, so that the number of unarmed Black men shot by cops, for example, for about a year in 2019 was listed as 9. Now it's 14, making a lot of sort of center-right articles on this seem wrong. Like, oh, those racists underestimated by half, even though it's a small number. But the reality is that someone simply went back through the machinery without doing what have traditionally been thought of as the ethical updates and changed that. And the point I'm making is this happens with more serious things, although that's quite a serious one. It happens with dictionary entries, e-encyclopedia entries, so on. So I think the real issue is that a lot of people are being sort of subtly gaslit. They'll attempt to pull up information about politics or sport or feminism that they know because it existed for years, and they'll find something else. That's the problem with this left-wing, click focus, so on, control of tech. You can literally just remove information you don't like. Like one of the wildest things for me was the internet deplatformings that happened this past year or two. And because they're all such politically incorrect people, no one cared. But if you look at like the entire alt-right, Milo Yiannopoulos, if you want to go back a year or two, Alex Jones, the entire InfoWars network, and then they moved left and they got rid of Minister Farrakhan, Cop Block, Chapo Trap House, all these things across almost every platform, coincidentally, within like a day or two disappeared. And this is just never mentioned. It's where'd Milo go? Where'd Minister Farrakhan go? I don't know. And there never was one. You know, so it's very much that Animal Farm sort of situation where you're expected not to notice this as the information changes around you. And I think that has almost mental health implications for a lot of people. If you try to go to, and some of these were fairly solid, conscious black pages. I mean, you owe blacks trillions. I'm not defending this anymore, the white equivalent, but there's a lot of normal people looked at these. I believe Third World Press got the chop. You try to find that, you can't find it. And the listed reason is, well, because it's evil and racist. And I mean, over on the hard right, Stefan Molyneux, there are at least 40 you could think of where this happened recently. And nothing was said except for a couple articles in the tech press. They're just gone. That ability to control information, whether or not you like Chapo Trap or any of those locations, is profoundly frightening. Conservative Treehouse just got censored. I think you were one of the people to comment on this when I said it on Twitter. Like WordPress, which is open to almost anything. It's like people's rape kink stories. I'm not saying that's the entire site, but they took down Conservative Treehouse because they said the content was offensive. That's a well-known right-wing blog. I mean, so probably 1 million hits per day are now not going to transfer into that site because it was simply removed. And there's never a reason given. That's one of the most remarkable things about dealing with these tech companies. Like, I mean, I'm a fairly well-known writer. I have across social media probably 150,000 followers if you're adding up Facebook pages and that sort of thing. 20,000 just on Twitter. But I mean, if my account was suspended for a day, I would have the same process as everyone else, which is that there's like, you can click this button and send an email to appeal. And if you do that 8 times, a college sophomore named Stan may talk to you. But it's intentionally this faceless process where like any middle manager at Twitter has the ability to shut down any business in the country.
Yeah, there's a lot of so when I was going through spy school originally, one of the things they said is you have to be above reproach. You have to act with honor and integrity all the time because you're going to take away someone's clearance. You're going to, there's a lot of different things that you're going to do, and you need to be like, just be honest, So when we look at the elections, why would you do things that on the face seem dishonest? Like if I'm counting votes, I don't care. Like if you're going to validate my count, come on, let's get this right. Let's do this together. This is America. The outcome is secondary here. What's more important is, do we trust these things? And so when you do a Google search, and I know you've done this, you've talked about this in your books, and you search whatever term it is, and then it's rigged to give you one perspective. And then you go to Bing and you get something totally different, and then probably go to Ask Jeeves and get something totally different. But the withdrawal of reality, it's like this thing when we're always struggling with, and for whatever reason, we never seem to figure this out, and I don't understand it. But Huck Finn, we struggle with this book because there's a lot of N-words in it and that kind of thing. But literally in the foreword, the author says, hey, I'm using the language of the region and time. Some of this is going to sting, but I'm doing this on purpose. It's like we lose our minds and we don't even bother to read the whole damn book. And so we have this lack of access to information from the people that are supposed to provide us all of the information ever and give you the best result to your search.
Yeah, well, I personally think all book burners have the same soul. Like, first of all, I think that the book burner in general probably doesn't know too much about the book they're burning. I remember I've talked to kind of anti-sex rad femme feminist friends about 50 Shades of Grey or The Story of O, these type of books. Those books are all about consent. Like, the woman's in charge 90% of the time, to the point that that sort of BDSM would feel kind of like boring role-playing to me. Not that you want total dominance, but if you're going to go through all this ritual and passwords and so on, you might as well just have sex, take that stupid sailor suit off. I mean, like, but the point is that these are not books about the abuse of women or anything like that, at least as a primary goal. They're often banned because people believe they are, because they would never read such pornographic filth. And it's the same thing with Huck Finn. I mean, the book does include the word nigger as a black guy. I'm not going to say N-word. And by the way, you hear The N word every time you play pickup basketball or football. You know, I mean, this is stupid.
Yeah.
But the book does include that, and that has horrified. It used to horrify religious purists. You know, there's never a place for profanity and demon rum, and now it horrifies these leftists who are just the flip side of church ladies. But the reality, as you said, is that the author is an anti-racist white Southerner who's making the point about how people talk to each other offensively. Gotta say, there are also characters called the Frenchman, Injun Joe. I mean, just so on down the line. The idea is this is how people talk to each other on the frontier. So, I mean, the idea of a bunch of guys, black, white, native, walking out of the woods with a pack of beaver skins on their back and calling each other sir and ma'am and so on is nonsensical. But there's a certain sort of person that likes that presentation of history. And you're actually starting to see more of that presentation of history, by the way. I mean, if you look at some of these shows, especially British TV, that are set in like the 1600s, they're very consciously trying to have like proportionate representation of minority characters. They're using more polite language that would have been used at the time. But I mean, like, so you'll see like the Duke of whatever will be presented as Chinese. And it's just something you're not supposed to notice. And it's kind of like, well, no, an Anglo-Saxon nobleman in this period would have been a white guy. Like, as a black guy, I have no problem with that. I'm not trying to turn on the TV and see Polish Zulus. Like, we know what Zulus look like. You know, so yeah, the censor tends to want a certain idealized world, even at the expense of truth. And there's always an inherent tension between the censor and the great books, because the great books point out how non-ideal the world is. People do have sex, and it gets funky and confusing. And people do fight wars, and often the general didn't even know where he was going, the charge of the light brigade. You know, this is reality, this sort of confusing mess of life, and it's important that people be able to discuss that. The character referred to bluntly as Nigger Jim in Huck Finn is the hero. Saves Huck a couple times. He's the best man in the book. So if you can't look past the name, and same thing with the Irishman or the Dauphin or Injun Joe, none of whom are terrible guys, and see, oh, well, this is the hero of the book, then you're an idiot. That's the point. But there are a whole bunch of people that fall in that category and that don't like that. And I think that's where censorship comes from. Other than a few things that have been viewed as evils really since the fall of Rome and the start of Christianity, I mean, child pornography, snuff films, terror plots against the king. Other than that kind of stuff, which we're all pretty much all in agreement on, I don't really think we should censor much of anything. You know, you age-graded requirements, you know, put it on the tall shelves. But there are very few books that I think a healthy 16-year-old kid couldn't read and benefit from.
And the left should really read 1984 a little bit more, because they're sort of acting it out, and it's terrifying. I wanted to get into this. I think it's a three-legged stool, but you're the political scientist, so you tell me. But it seems like when it comes to voting, we've got this problem between security, which is called suppression, it's a lot of times, and then, you know, enfranchisement. But then there's also the requirement that you have to know what the hell you're doing. Like, you have to spend time. I was having a conversation with someone who's left leaning, and you know, and I'm pretty middle, but I definitely go hard left on some things, hard right on others. I'm like a standard person. I'm a mix of hypocrisy. So she was saying, "Oh no, a friend of ours, mutual friend, said, I'm not sure how to vote on this issue. What are you guys doing?" And I said, you know, whatever I would say, like, yeah, if all else fails, just vote no. You know, like, that's nothing else if you can't decide. It's probably, if it's not clear, yeah, just vote no. And then I got a little bit of, you know, trouble with the crew. And this girl said, I'm a fast shopper. I know exactly how to vote, which was really, she votes left the entire time. So we have this voter knowledge problem. We don't want to suppress votes, but we also want to have a secure election. What the heck do we do with all this?
I'm a fan of pretty standard election rules that we had until recently. You show your ID, you vote using a paper ballot, you watch it go into the ballot box, you have viewers from both parties there. I think that the entire voter suppression narrative is pretty much bullshit. I'll get into voter fraud too. I think the right greatly exaggerates the rate of voter fraud. But when people say I became very interested in this a couple of years ago as a young political scientist, because I kept hearing there's a massive amount of voter fraud or voter suppression, especially here in the Upper South. And I would actually call people sometimes and ask about these claims. And every single one came down to one of two things. Either people were required to have some kind of picture ID, or there were slightly fewer voting machines in poor districts than in rich ones. That's what voter suppression means. I don't want to say the corny right-wing stuff, you suck it up, buttercup. But I mean, when you hear voter suppression, people intentionally use these powerful terms. Just like people intentionally say Black Lives Matter, all lives matter, choose life. You're not just saying something generic. You're using a slogan that's evocative for a reason. Voter suppression calls to mind, Bull Connor standing in the courthouse door with a German Shepherd in each hand. That's not what we're talking about. Like, there actually have been a number of pretty serious studies. I believe it's the University of Kansas just called a bunch of people on the voting roster and asked them if they had a driver's license. 95% of them said yeah. Now, I would assume that others had something like a state ID, a college ID card, firearm owner card. There are other studies that mostly come from the left that attempt to say that as many as 13-14% of people don't have ID. But what they are saying in that case is generally something like a non-expired, non-levied against, i.e. no traffic tickets or anything like that, current in-state ID for your state. And I get the point. I get why that would be important for some social services. But my understanding is that you just need a signed picture ID to vote in the strictest states. So that wouldn't necessarily be relevant. That 95% of people have a driver's license statistic is probably roughly accurate. So I certainly favor helping out those that don't. I mean, maybe $5 IDs for a month before Election Day or something like that. But once you've made it possible for people to do that, made it even easier than it is today, because it ain't hard to go down to the DMV, Haas. But I mean, I don't see any reason in the world you wouldn't have to do that. So I don't really favor more. If I were going to do one thing to stop quote unquote voter suppression, which doesn't exist, it means you need to have the ID that you take to liquor stores to go vote. The thing that I would do is probably just make Election Day a holiday. I mean, that automatically we know would boost the vote by about 15%. And that to me would stop all excuses. Like if you chose to work a double shift that day, okay, you just made $500 or whatever for not going to vote. That's your decision. Right. But I mean, other than that, I wouldn't do too much. Voter fraud is a different situation. I do think, now again, anyone you talk to on the left in political science, so like know your bias, is going to say there's some suppression. Anyone on the right is going to say there's some substantial amount of fraud. So, this may reflect my bias. But it strikes me that voter fraud probably is pretty common in the same way that music piracy is pretty common. In a typical year, we recently heard the record companies, the RIAA, say that they had almost broken piracy. There were only 90 or whatever it was arrests for music piracy in the year in question. If you go over to www.thepiratebay.org, you'll see that there are about 27 million active users on a typical day. I mean, you can get the latest album, movie, whatever for free. Now, I'm too old and dignified to, have movies with subtitles in Vietnamese playing on the screen if you're spending a night with your partner or something. But I'm very aware that site exists. So the idea 80 people got caught, well, I guess those idiots weren't using a VPN. I'm sure if you bootleg 8 movies and you don't have your computer protected, the landlord will come downstairs and the local cops will come over. But that's not what people do. I mean, the Tor browser has been an open secret for 10, 12, 15 years now. So I would say it's the same thing with voter fraud. Like, of course, if you go vote and then you strap on a mustache and you walk to the other polling place in your town and you vote again, you'll probably be arrested. But the way voter fraud would actually work, I mean, there are 3 fairly common techniques that I've heard mentioned in urban political circles. I can't speak to the frequency of any of them. But I mean, one would simply be not vetting the motor voter rolls. I mean, in most states, if you sign up for a driver's license, you're automatically registered to vote. Does this quick process that goes on while you're printing out your ID in Kentucky, does that check to see if you are a felon? Does that check to see if you are an illegal immigrant to the country? I would suspect either no, or that in many counties, there's an upper level clerk that's supposed to do that, but who can be circumvented. I mean, so that would be a guess there, but a valid one. Another technique of fraud that I know occurred in the past is what's called union slate voting, where if you are, say, the teachers union on, say, the south side of, say, 1990s Chicago, you might allegedly have a roster of all of the members of the union. And because teachers frequently go on vacations, sabbaticals, half don't work in the summer, during a major election, you might send in younger proxies to vote for those people that you've identified by name and address who can't vote. I mean, certainly during the Tammany Hall era up until the modern Mayor Daley era, people were suspected of doing this for 20 or 25 people in a day and then going home and eating a chicken. So there's no real reason that couldn't happen. I think modern cameras would make it less likely. Another modern technique is ballot harvesting, which has been legalized in many states. Ballot harvesting is simply, you literally go around to a vulnerable population like older ladies. You pick up ballots that haven't been filled out or that supposedly have been filled out, and you deliver them to the party as a favor. Would it be entirely easy for someone to pick up 100 of these ballots, throw them in a gunny sack, and have something like the Ilhan Omar campaign fill them all out? Yes. That was actually recently alleged in a video that was posted to Instagram Live, had hundreds of likes, that was actually snatched up by Project Veritas that you can still find on the internet. Google Ilhan Omar ballot harvesting. So I tend to suspect that that goes on pretty frequently. Why wouldn't it? I mean, it's like cheating in college athletics. Like, does the head coach know? Probably not, but he doesn't have to. I mean, what you would do is tell your youngest assistant, you know, the best recruiter with the snappy jump shot, hey, I want that kid. Don't tell me how you get him. Similarly, if you are a political campaign and you're working with these grassroots offices, you know, sketchy preachers and storefront churches and so on, why wouldn't you say, well, sure, we want everyone's vote to count. Please bring in all the votes from that housing project or that nursing home complex. And, you know, will those come in as God intended, filled out by the original recipient? Who's to say? So those are some techniques that at least could make voter fraud possible. And I mean, I think what I would do in elections is strengthen the system against those. I would ban ballot harvesting all out. I don't see a reason for that at all. I mean, your grandson can take that ballot down to the mailbox or whatever the case might be, or your preacher, or yourself. I mean, the majority of people are not homebound and helpless. You know, so I would get rid of that. Union slate, I guess you just have to pay more attention, and I would vet the motor voter process. But other than that, I would simply have elections as we've always had elections. I'm not a big fan of mail-in voting. I'm not a fan of electronic voting at all, and so on down the line.
Yeah, the electronic voting thing is, I'm a fan of figuring out what it means. I mean, if we can do a lot of these things electronically with millions of dollars, we should be able to protect the vote. But I also understand that that's a lot harder said than done. The other thing about the voter, just in general, the impropriety, to kind of lift the bar a little bit, not make it necessarily fraud, just the chicanery in general, you know, that's happening. One of the things, and you've heard me say this, one of the things that I've noticed a lot in conflict zones is that the specter is always more powerful than the actual thing. But it is real. Like, if you have 70 million people that think this is a bogus election, you know, and they have all this circumstantial evidence, like Donald Trump can show up and 50,000 people want to be there out in the cold to hear him talk, you know, and, you know, when Joe Biden says, you know, basically, yeah, I'm going to get us off of oil, and then Pennsylvania goes for it. It's like, well, this doesn't make any damn sense. And so all of a sudden you quickly get this narrative where elections aren't secure, you know, and there will always be, and the other thing, you can't say that there's not fraud and impropriety, because there always is. Someone's always going to try to game the system, because that's what people do. The amount of mistrust in not only in our elections, but now the FBI has compromised itself. You know, it's to the point where they have this. Look, Hillary Clinton had top secret emails on her server in her garage. She's not somehow in jail. I would be in jail. You would be in. All kinds of people would be in jail for that. And so you look at these institutions that were once revered, you know, I mean, if someone kidnaps your kid, good chance the FBI is going to save your ass, and you're going to rely on them for that. But if they're not going to put some high level, you know, diplomat, or, I mean, we just had a diplomat talk about lying to the president to keep service members in. And that's just, if you all don't know the story, I'm talking to the audience specifically here. If you don't know the story of Kenton Stacy, email me and I'll send it to you. This dude who wasn't supposed to be on this deployment, but he's like, you know, my job is to go, so I'll go. Walks into a room and gets blown up. Neck gets broken, loses his voice, loses an eye, and he's paralyzed. He's a quadriplegic now over something in Syria. So when the president's like, I don't want that anymore, whoever the president is, they get to say that. And to have someone lie, like, how do I even trust diplomats now? The mistrust that we're building and sowing over politics, it's not a path that we can stay on and remain the nation that we are.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely troubling. There are a lot of elements here. I mean, I don't really think that there's more corruption in politics today than there was during the Kennedy-Nixon era, in all honesty. Sure. We have a lot more media. I think we have a lot more good independent journalists of the Andy Ngo variety. So I think a lot more dirt gets found out, really more than anything else. But I think in that climate, it is especially important for people to, most human leaders, especially males, are pretty amoral and predatory, something I'm very comfortable with. There aren't that many good people, and I think they need to find safe places like the church. But definitely, if you are being watched by a very large number of ordinary citizens, it's very important to, as Machiavelli said, appear to be good. So I think that in the current media climate, it's absolutely important that institutions like the FBI basically follow the rules. And yeah, they really haven't. Like, I don't especially like Trump, to be blunt, but one of the aspects of the Trump administration that got a lot of people to vote for this dude, if we're being honest, was the obvious, constant, dubiously legal attacks on him. Like, we've already talked about mainstream and social media absolutely shuttering his accurate October surprise. But the stuff with quote unquote Spygate was even more bizarre. I mean, where it now does look like there's pretty solid evidence that for a variety of made up reasons, like this Michael Flynn stuff, our intelligence agencies were following the president-elect around for a long time. And a lot of the things that came out of that whole process, like the Steele dossier, we're now not even sure what country that dude was an agent for. Just like this dubious crap information was circulated over and over and over again in the media. And the Syrian troops thing, I think, is the ultimate example of this in terms of this kind of institutional disrespect or circumvention of the president, where what Trump was trying to do was pull U.S. troops out of what's basically a conflict zone where people died. And this is mostly civvy side officials, by the way, but I mean, our State Department, DOD, so on, basically just lied to him about the number of soldiers that were in the area, using these sort of tricks to claim that there were, 200 current active duty troops, while actually keeping between 900 and 2,000 there. That's absolutely wild. So I don't really know what I would suggest in terms. First of all, I think that a president who's more familiar with Washington, D.C. and more able to ride herd on these people would prevent a lot of this. But I mean, I don't really know how to stop this problem. I just know that, yeah, if you have a constant media presence and you have officials that are breaking the law or damn near, that's going to create distrust in the institution. And that's extremely unfortunate. There are still some stable, highly viewed institutions. I mean, the Supreme Court, regardless of its political makeup, so on down the line. I mean, the country's not falling apart anytime soon. But yeah, this is an issue. I think that the fanaticism that many, many people engaged in to break and remove Trump brought their own institutions into far more disrepute than they would have been had they simply gone along with a lot of the things Trump suggested. This is separate from Trump's crazy behavior now, which I don't think anyone approves of.
Some of these things, the Trump doctrine, as it breaks out, some of these things are going to hold, just like, President Obama runs reform on President Bush's platform. I mean, that's what you do as a challenger, and then literally follows the Trump doctrine. I mean, the Bush doctrine down the line. So some of these Trumpian things that worked are going to survive. Is it holding our partners accountable in NATO? Is it going after China to I mean, look, and I keep saying this because this also never gets covered in the media. We open every 10 hours, we open a counterintelligence investigation against China. They're constantly trying to steal our IP, steal our secrets, steal all the time. And so he was the guy that said, we don't have to do that. We can go after these guys and we can make our own stuff. So some of these things I think will remain, hopefully. I mean, it's just kind of hard to change the ship. It's kind of bad to change the ship's direction that fast anyhow and go back to something that wasn't working as well. What do you think survives from the Bush or from the Trump doctrine? And again, let me just say this out loud so everybody can. I'm not a fan of President Trump. I didn't vote for him. I don't care for anything he is personally, but he is not a singular failure. He has a lot of things on the good side that did work, like his funding of HBCUs. I mean, there's a lot of good in there if we can allow him some small victories, which we have to. If we're going to be reasonable, we have to say these are some of the good things. These are some of the I don't knows, and there's a whole lot of this garbage over here that's terrible.
Yeah, well, I think one of the things that I said on Twitter today actually is that so you're absolutely right. That's a good analysis. Like, there are a lot of things Trump said that are going to continue on after the Trump administration. I would say that most people prefer Trumpism to Trump. There's this idea on kind of the bougie urban left that Trump supporters are a bunch of toothless hicks that have multiple pictures of the Donald on their walls and so on, and that just love the cult of personality, the big guy, the red tie. In reality, the few times I've actually seen people go in depth and ask Trump supporters why they voted for Trump, I mean, the reasons were very mundane things like, I'm a Republican. So again, Trump won the standard 92% of Republicans in this most recent election. When people say all Trump voters are racist, no, the majority of Republicans are going to vote for the Republican unless he kills a baby on stage. Perhaps even because they feel that the Democrats do that every day. So they're Republicans, they support certain policies, so on. And what really made Trump, despite his lack of political experience, such a popular political figure was that he was saying things that nobody else was, that are obviously true. Like, why don't we only let in high-performing immigrants that want to assimilate? That is an obvious question. Why don't we have a border security wall like Mexico does? He added that addendum by the third or fourth time he asked that question. So on down the line. Why don't we make stuff in America? We love the Brits and even the French, but what's the point of NATO? Russia's gone. These are just obvious questions. Why are we in all these Middle Eastern wars? Why are we focused so much on the Palestinians? This is a tiny rubble-filled country without mocking. Why don't we work on getting the Arabs that can fight, the Saudis and so on, together with the Israelis, so we don't have to fight over there anymore? And all of these obvious ideas made sense, and many of them came to fruition. I mean, Trump was nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize something like 3 times because of the post-Yugoslav peace, the UAE-Israel peace, so on down the line. So on the one hand, Trump, probably not the ideal figure, a big shouting guy to talk about a lot of this stuff. Trumpism, very popular. And I think Twitter has had an impact on the lack of development of other Trumps. One of the advantages I have as a political commentator is that I kind of grew up in the hood. And I went to school at just mainstream Big Ten style Midwestern schools. I was an athlete early on in life. I traveled outside of this country. I wasn't really exposed to this specific, like, lower upper class culture of political correctness and wokeness, which I think has nothing to offer. I mean, if you analyze the scientific points they make, like the Ibram Kendi argument that all group gaps are caused either by racism or genetics, they fall apart in moments. I mean, there are people like Thomas Sowell and Amy Chua that just specialize in breaking these arguments. But I think that entire culture is very dominant on, for example, Twitter. So I think that a lot of people find the Overton window shifting. So that instead of saying men can't be women, like most people would in a bar without necessarily even endorsing that sentiment, people on Twitter say things like, well, of course you can be transgender, but that doesn't change the underlying reality of biological sex. And Trump came from the business world, the primetime television world, outside this political correctness. The guy literally ran beauty pageants for underage models. I mean, like, you can do him as sleazy or not, but this is the kind of guy you're talking about. So he just said the stuff that many or most people think, and that's why he got elected. But someone that could say that same stuff without adding all the stupid nonsense while we're being blunt, like Megyn Kelly's bleeding out her hoo-ha, just these crazy Trump comments, would be more popular. This is, by the way, why two of my favorite politicians to watch have been Trump and Bill Clinton, because they were just these big, funny guys that had already made it where they wanted to be in life. Clinton was governor of Arkansas. Trump was a billionaire. And they just ran for office saying shit that was true. Like, Bill Clinton's whole pitch was, I'm a Democrat. I favor health care, but I mean, you can't give everybody welfare. I mean, he just had these hilarious quotes, liked women. And people liked him and voted for him, liked Trump and voted for him. But somebody without those weaknesses would be substantially harder to bring down once they're in office. I mean, I noticed Trump and Clinton both got impeached. I prefer presidents that don't get impeached.
Yeah. Like, is it possible to have a consensus builder? You know, like the standard statesman stool, you know, moral compass and all that stuff, a vision, and then build consensus. Does that exist right now or no?
As long as they're willing to do actual new original things, I think it does.
Okay.
So there are different types of political leader, obviously. I do think on the GOP right, there was a lot of irritation with the only candidates that they, or we, I sometimes vote Republican, were getting for a while. I mean, you talk about the John McCains, the Mitt Romneys, you know, the H.W. Bushes. Perot is basically a Republican. You could throw him in here. But guys in suits that were enjoyable, that had served the country well, but that you knew weren't really going to do anything too remarkable. Like George W. Bush kind of broke this mold, flamboyant Texas guy. But also, I mean, his immigration policy was pretty standard, dim Republican. I mean, he would frequently give speeches in Spanish and so on, which I speak better than he does. But so on down the line. I think that the GOP in particular got really tired of that kind of candidate, where you knew that when the Republican was elected, there was going to be an 8% cut in taxes, and that was it. They were going to do photo ops with turkeys. They weren't dramatically going to reduce our military footprint. They weren't going to stop immigration. They weren't really going to slow crime. Crime is already in decline at that point, I will say, to be fair. The same thing for the Democrats, but to a lesser extent, because there have at least been big Democratic ideas recently. Gay marriage, which I support, was one of them. What else? Healthcare. I have mixed feelings about Obamacare. You know, I run businesses. I can build a website that can handle, million hit traffic for about $500. I don't know what the hell went wrong with their website, which cost $1 billion. There were all these little mistakes that made me think, do I really want to give up, Dr. Singh and join this system? But at any rate, he had big ideas at least. A lot of that 1619 stuff, for good or ill, started under Obama. Black Lives Matter started under Obama. I think that what Trump brought to the table, for all his flaws, was big Republican ideas for the first time in a while. More limited, more merit-based immigration, but absolutely anti-racist immigration is a big idea. Building a border wall, or at least something like a drone screen, actual border defense. You know how insecure the border is. That is an actual big Republican idea. Trump didn't ever say this well, but what he's talking about is a manufacturing base, or what the French call infant industries protection. Some things, 10% or whatever, just have to be made in America. And we sort of venerate those towns, the steel region of Pennsylvania, that make those things. The French are very much about this. Like, you can only call your wine champagne if it's made in one 6-mile area in the south of France, and you will be sued, if not physically attacked, if you try to call it something other than sparkling wine, or you're from anywhere else. That's a big Republican idea. The idea of a Middle East peace not involving the Palestinians, that's a big Republican idea. So I think a lot of people looked at Trump and said, okay, this is a profoundly flawed man, but so am I, according to Jesus. And this guy wants to do something about the border security problem. And that's why Trump got elected. When people say Trump got elected because of dumb tweets or alleged racism, those, to every Republican I know, were the negatives. Like, if I were playing golf with like a black buddy and a Republican buddy, me and the other dude would be teasing the Republican guy about that stuff, and they wouldn't be thrilled about it. So that was a bug. It wasn't a feature. And I think that there's this frenzied attempt by the mainstream left-leaning media to paint it as a feature. Like, well, what they really loved about him was that he once insulted Haiti. And it's more like, no, people didn't care about that. People didn't care that the guy who proposed, the tax cut and the border security plan said that Haiti was a crappy, badly run country. I'm not going to give my opinion on that on air, but it wasn't something that horrified most Americans. It also wasn't something that geeked them out and thrilled them. But I mean, so anyway, Trumpism will continue on past Trump. I don't think there's any dispute about that.
One of the things we got from the Trump administration is being a net exporter of energy, which is an enormously powerful tool for us in a lot of different ways. Do you have hopes that the Biden administration can take this win and turn it into something longer lasting?
Well, sort of. I mean, my question with Uncle Joe, I don't really have a problem with Joe Biden as a politician, by the way. Joe Biden wrote the 1994 crime bill, which was a good bill. Crime was through the roof in black communities, by the way, also poor white communities before 1994. I've looked at the rates of crime in New York across African American, Puerto Rican, Italian American, every group you could imagine, youth before that period. I mean, remember the Central Park Five? Like, whether or not those individual kids didn't do that crime, there were literally mobs of people running through public parks, beating and raping other citizens. The reason the Central Park Five claimed innocence was that they apparently were involved in a series of mob beatings, but they didn't rape one woman. This is the kind of chaotic crime environment that we were looking at until 1994. So Biden was responsible for that. Biden worked with Gingrich and so on, getting things done across party lines. I don't have a huge issue with Uncle Joe. The issue with Joe Biden is what he's going to do when he's in office. Because when I say I don't have a huge issue with Uncle Joe, I mean like with who Biden actually is, which is a moderate, mildly corrupt politician with some good one-liners. The question is what his administration's going to do. So this is the Trojan horse problem a lot of people had with Biden on the right. Biden's pitch is I'm going to run a centrist government for one administration and then I'm going to die. I don't mean to mock him, but that's pretty much what he's saying. Like, I'm going to peacefully retire from this mortal coil. He's mentioned he's going to be a one-term president. Obviously, we don't want him to die, but I mean, he's 78. You know, his whole thing is I'm going to come in. I'm endorsed by Cindy McCain. I'm endorsed by people across the spectrum. I'm going to be fairly dignified, strong on the military, might do a little stuff domestically. The question, though, is, I mean, the vice president's Kamala Harris, who was, by at least one metric, the most liberal regularly voting member of the Senate. And now you've got the pitch from all of the people that Biden ran against in the primary race, most of whom he's pretty friendly with. I mean, Bernie Sanders, Liz Warren, Pete Buttigieg, all these people. AOC wasn't in that race, will be in the next one. All these people are seeking nearly cabinet level positions. So if you have Bernie Sanders as a Secretary of Labor, which is deeply ironic, this guy hasn't worked in his life, in my opinion. But I mean, like, you know, if you have that, or, you know, Elizabeth Warren regulating the big banks, you know, what are you going to get? One of the things that I'm not, you know, sort of James Lindsay level angry about, but that I do wonder about is how much woke crap is going to get shoehorned in there. Wokeness is easy for Democrats to do because they don't have to give up their corporate base to do it. The reality is that the city boys have been doing pretty well recently. If you look at middle-class Black communities, Asian communities, Jewish American communities, tech workers, all that. So the Democrats have found themselves no longer the party of poor people. This is something that's rarely discussed outside of dense political science papers, and it is fairly important. The primary donor groups for the Democratic Party, the trial lawyers, the union teachers, give more money than the primary donor groups to the Republican Party. So the Democrats, and I don't think this is a coincidence, have really modulated their class message in recent years. I mean, Hillary Clinton's proposed national minimum wage was, I think, $11. It's higher than that half the states already. So that's become kind of a dross. And instead, you've seen all this stuff like, well, the really oppressed people are, you know, Native American, Indian, omnigender, lesbians. And I do wonder how much of this we're going to see. I mean, what's going to be the military policy on multiple genders? What's the president going to say about biological males participating in female athletics? You know, are we going to bring back the teaching of actual critical race theory to government employees in mandatory sessions? I mean, I pretty strongly oppose that. I suspect you would. So that's the question with Biden. Is he going to be the centrist kind of war hawk who wrote 1994 and is going to just do a decent job as president? Or is his administration going to be full of these virtue signals to every group that helped him out? Union teachers, i.e. a slap at charter schools, wokeness, i.e. 1619, so on down the line. And that's the problem that most conservatives have with Joe Biden. It's not Joe Biden himself. It's running mate, it's proposed ideas, it's backing the Green New Deal. Like, what are you talking about here, Uncle Joe?
I'm pretty open with my negativity towards Kamala Harris because, you know, she has acted like she hates most of us. And so I believe her, you know, it's like, I trust you with that. And then Joe Biden has been horrible at foreign policy. Like, one of his ideas was to divide Iraq into 3 countries, and it just was so nonsensical. It's like, you are a non-starter when it comes to foreign policy. And again, back to Kamala Harris, her breakdown in the vice president debate of foreign policy was, you know, be cool with your homies and go after your enemies, which is cute, but, you know, doesn't answer how you deal with the Russian, Turkey, China problem, you know, in terms of letting those guys stabilize and have that resources that they need while still protecting places like the Crimea and everything. Like, she can't talk about those things intelligently. And so, yeah, I wonder, Donald Trump aside, okay, let's say he's out. I wonder about the capacity of these two to get this stuff in. I mean, voting for the lesser of two evils is still voting for evil. We have not had a candidate that we're like, yes, this person can do it in a long time. Joe Biden was rejected by his party over and over and over again until just after Super Tuesday. Somehow this flipped. And then you and I got as many delegates as Kamala Harris did, you know? So there's a problem with our selection process where we're getting these people that are not the people's choice. Look, if you would have put Andrew Yang forward or Tulsi Gabbard, I could, even though I probably wouldn't vote for a lot of the other senators and whatnot, I could vote for either of those people because I think that there's a genuine care for all of us. But this ticket is for me, it's a problem. And I think that they will reform the reform Build back better. Like has there been a worse political slogan than that? And just for the sake of undoing what Donald Trump did, and just take us further down this divisive, trying to race us to a civil war, or the breakup of the United States as fast as we can.
Well, I don't think things will go on at that level. I mean, so right now in social science, we tend to think in terms of standard deviations. And right now, like, i.e., how far the chance of something occurring is from, the median of a set of data. And I think that right now there is very, very little chance of a civil war in the USA. I mean, I think you'd have to go through multiple cycles where the variance keeps increasing, quote unquote, for that to be anywhere near possible. I mean, I think right now you'd be more likely to get something like a Dan Crenshaw, Tulsi Gabbard 2024 ticket, where the slogan is "Everybody calm down." I mean, we've been through this much more severely in, 1968, 1929. I mean, 1861, although then we had a big war. But I mean, just so on multiple combos of years. So I don't see that happening. I do think that a big problem for both sides, but especially on the left, is this idea that people that disagree with you are evil. This is actually something I've noticed over the years debating online, that people on the right who strongly disagree with you tend to think you're stupid. At the margins, they might think that you are culturally or genetically inferior, although generally not by much. But I mean, of course, that's bad. But people on the left who disagree with you tend to think you're evil. Like, the only situation where the right approaches this shrillness would be probably talking about abortion. But people on the left will openly say things like, "Oh, you don't want a COVID lockdown? How many grandmothers do you want to die?" And I think that this does translate into what Thomas Sowell called the division of society into the anointed and the benighted, where the idea is that those people that don't agree with your vision of the country, which I would say roughly put would be that the USA should be a socialist, majority minority, largely disarmed society by around 2050, those are evil, negative people. And you see this in the language that's used. I mean, Barack Obama, bitter clingers holding on to their stupid guns and Bibles. Hillary Clinton, a basket full of deplorables, and so on down to the line. I don't know if Kamala Harris hates half the country, but I mean, I do think that many people in the USA are tired of what they view as this sort of out of touch elite, diverse in skin color terms, but almost all center left rather than class left or right wing, almost all based in big cities and a few coastal enclaves, really no more successful than the rest of us. If you look at those places like Seattle and Portland versus like Louisville, but telling the entirety of the country what to do. And I certainly think there'll be a backlash to that during the Biden-Harris administration. This will, of course, get even more serious if Joe Biden dies. I mean, this is one of the elephants in the room. Biden is 78, and we're going into kind of the winter of COVID-19. So, I mean, I think a President Harris would be very different from a President Biden in terms of initiatives and what they actually went out there and got done.
Yeah, and it's a 2020, so that divisible by 10 number when presidents tend to die, not that that's any kind of real math or nothing like that, but he's an old dude, and he might just say, "I've had enough." I mean, I think you could find tens of millions of people that would say Joe Biden is not well enough to be president, and that's a legitimate concern. We never got to deal with it. We never got that's the other thing with it. I hope that the current form of doing debates is done, because you can't have something that's more unfair to both candidates, especially whoever the Republican candidate is, than to have to answer your response to COVID crisis in 2 minutes or less. It's a ridiculous way to try to do this, and absolutely reeks of partisan. And that's not how I want to pick my president. I want to pick someone who I can hear them, go on Rogan, go on Turner's show, go on whoever show it's going to be, and really dive into what their platform is so we can understand that they're more than talking points.
I like the choices there, like Rogan, Turner, one of them, whoever they pick.
Whatever.
Turner. Yeah. But both. I mean, no, I actually like the debate format as one of several options. But yeah, I think that presidential candidates should be encouraged to do as much long form as possible. One of the things that's kind of disturbing about this is that they generally won't. This is another thing. We have kind of a handler culture. We have a non-debate culture. So Ben Shapiro, who's obviously right wing, but I think a very fair, honest actor in terms of what he says, in terms of calling
Yeah.
balls and strikes, actually friends with Joe Rogan, has openly offered to let every one of the Democratic challengers in 2020 go on his podcast and do the Sunday special and debate him for an hour and a half. And the only one that did it was Andrew Yang, who did a good job, handled all of Ben's questions. But I mean, I can't help thinking when you look at like the smart young guys that could have been benefited by that, there's no reason in the world Pete Buttigieg didn't do that. A bit more obscure. I mean, there's no reason Amy Klobuchar didn't do that, or anyone on the back bench like Governor Bullock, who would have had a good time sparring with Ben Shapiro and apparently likes him. They didn't do that because they would have been torn up by the national left had they done it. So, I mean, this is something that is going to have to be overcome before we see more long form. Why wouldn't Kamala Harris do Joe Rogan? I mean, she apparently smokes weed. She's a pretty funny woman, got kind of the Joker laugh going on. Why wouldn't she do it? Because she'd immediately then be criticized for, entertaining a racist, anti-feminist, transphobe weightlifter.
Right.
So there's a huge restriction on politicians, and especially on politicians on the Democratic side, from having kind of quote unquote real talk conversations with anyone.
I don't want to take too much more of your time because we've got several shows this week. I can't wait to talk down ticket items with Dave Daly. That's going to be interesting. But anything in closing in general on the election and what we've seen or are experiencing now?
Quick closing remark. I mean, first of all, I think it's important for Americans to be American and to accept the results, whatever they turn out to be. I mean, it's 85% likely or more Trump is going to lose these election challenges. That would make Biden the president. See what he does, give him 100 days, as opposed to, just insisting Trump is president for 4 years and kind of declowning yourself. The same thing on the left in the off chance Trump wins, or in the definite probabilistic chance the Republicans take control of the Senate. Don't burn things down like small babies, accept and watch how the government works. Lobby your candidate for things you want. I mean, as we've seen these past couple of years, even in terms of some of the examples we gave, like dictionary redefinition, one individual can make a difference. The political science prof stuff aside, I mean, I think we all agree, just talking to you today, talking to friends leading up to the show, we all agree that there are obvious problems with the election process. So let's think about what those are and work to fix them. Other than that, not much to say.
I like it. Well, we'll talk again, I think, on Wednesday or I don't know, whatever day, but he'll be back and we'll talk to Dave Daly and that'll be fun. Hey, man, I appreciate you coming on as always. It's always good to have you break these things down.
Yeah, always chopping up with you too, man. Have a good day.